What if the most diabetes-friendly carbohydrate in existence grows wild across America, produces food for decades from one planting, and was deliberately removed from every seed catalog in the country? Native Americans knew it as survival food. Colonizers called it competition. And today, most people walk past it without recognizing the food source that could make them completely independent from grocery stores. Let me tell you about a plant that has been so thoroughly suppressed that most Americans do not even know it is native to North America. A plant that was the foundation of indigenous food security for thousands of years. A plant that European colonizers systematically replaced with crops that required annual dependence. This is about a plant that succeeded too well and had to be eliminated because success without dependence threatens every profitable food system ever created. The plant is Jerusalem artichoke, also called sunchoke, scientifically known as Helianthus tuberosus. The name is deliberately misleading. This plant is not from Jerusalem and has nothing to do with the Middle East. It is native to North America. The name Jerusalem artichoke likely comes from the Italian word girasole, meaning sunflower, or was deliberately attached to make it sound exotic and foreign, distancing it from its indigenous American origins. Calling it Jerusalem artichoke instead of its Native American names was the first step in erasing its true identity. The tubers taste like a cross between a potato and a water chestnut, with a slightly sweet, nutty flavor and crisp texture when raw or creamy when cooked. The artichoke comparison came from French colonists who thought the flavor resembled artichoke hearts. But this plant is not an artichoke. It is a perennial sunflower that produces edible tubers underground, and those tubers have been feeding people on this continent for at least 3,000 years. Native American tribes across the eastern woodlands, the Great Lakes region, and the plains cultivated and harvested Jerusalem artichokes as a staple food. The tubers were dug in late fall and winter when other food sources were scarce. They store extremely well in the ground, meaning you do not need to harvest everything at once. You can dig them up as needed throughout winter because freezing temperatures do not harm them. In fact, cold improves their flavor by converting some of the inulin into sweeter sugars. This made Jerusalem artichoke the ultimate winter food security crop. While European grains required harvest, threshing, storage infrastructure, and protection from rodents and moisture, Jerusalem artichoke tubers stayed fresh in the soil until you needed them. No storage barns, no grain silos, no risk of rot or pest infestation. The earth itself was the storage system. Indigenous peoples also understood something that modern science only recently confirmed. Jerusalem artichoke tubers are one of the best sources of inulin, a type of carbohydrate that does not spike blood sugar the way starch does. Inulin is not digested in the stomach or small intestine. Instead, it passes to the colon where it feeds beneficial gut bacteria. This means Jerusalem artichokes provide energy without causing the blood sugar spikes and crashes associated with potatoes, rice, or wheat. For people managing diabetes or insulin resistance, this is revolutionary. You can eat a filling, carbohydrate-rich food that does not trigger the metabolic damage caused by high glycemic starches. And Native Americans were eating this routinely long before anyone understood the science of glycemic index or gut microbiome health. When European colonizers arrived and observed indigenous agricultural systems, they documented Native Americans cultivating these tubers extensively. French explorers in the early 1600s wrote about them relying on Jerusalem artichokes through winter. Samuel de Champlain documented eating them and compared the taste to artichokes, which is likely how that part of the name originated. English settlers also encountered them and initially adopted them into colonial gardens. For a brief period in the 1600s and 1700s, Jerusalem artichokes were grown in Europe and the American colonies. Recipes appeared in cookbooks. They were sold in markets. But then something changed. By the 1800s, Jerusalem artichoke began disappearing from seed catalogs and agricultural guides. By the early 1900s, it was almost completely absent from mainstream agriculture. Today, most people have never heard of it, despite the fact that it still grows wild across North America in ditches, roadsides, and abandoned fields. So what happened? Why did a plant that fed entire populations for millennia suddenly vanish? The answer is a combination of factors that all serve the same purpose: creating dependence on annual crops controlled by agricultural corporations. Let me break down the mechanisms of suppression. First, there was the colonial food system replacement. European colonizers brought an agricultural philosophy designed around control and dependence. European feudal systems were built on landlords controlling grain production. Peasants paid rent in grain and bought seed from landowners. The entire social structure depended on crops that required annual planting. Jerusalem artichoke did not fit that model. Plant it once and it produces for decades. Tubers left in the ground regrow the following year. That kind of independence is incompatible with systems built on controlling food access. So colonizers promoted wheat, corn, and potatoes. These crops required replanting every year and created dependency on the agricultural calendar, land access, and infrastructure. Jerusalem artichoke did not. That made it dangerous. Second, there was the seed industry that began forming in the 1800s. As commercial seed companies emerged, they needed products that generated repeat customers, hybrid varieties that did not breed true from saved seed, annual crops that required purchasing new stock every year. Jerusalem artichoke was the opposite. It is not a hybrid. It reproduces from tubers. One tuber saved from your harvest becomes next year's crop. In fact, the problem farmers often report with Jerusalem artichoke is that it is too prolific. Miss a few tubers during harvest and they regrow. It spreads. It establishes permanent patches. For a subsistence farmer or homesteader, this is perfect. Plant it once and you have permanent food. For seed companies, this is a disaster. A customer who plants Jerusalem artichoke stops being a customer. They never need to buy seeds again. Third, there was the agricultural standardization movement of the late 1800s and early 1900s. As farming industrialized, the focus shifted to crops that could be grown in monoculture, harvested mechanically, and transported long distances. Jerusalem artichoke does not fit that system. The tubers are irregular in shape. They are knobby and difficult to peel. They do not store well out of the ground for long periods. They are best harvested fresh as needed throughout winter by digging them up. This is perfect for small-scale, localized food systems. It is terrible for industrial agriculture that depends on uniform products, mechanical harvest, and long-distance shipping to centralized markets. Industrial agriculture could not profit from Jerusalem artichoke, so it was not promoted. Fourth, there was the rise of the potato industry. Potatoes became the dominant tuber crop in European and American agriculture because they fit industrial models better than Jerusalem artichokes. Potatoes produce larger, more uniform tubers that can be mechanically harvested and stored in warehouses. They also require replanting every year, creating seed sales. The potato industry invested heavily in breeding programs, marketing, and infrastructure. Jerusalem artichoke got zero investment because there was no way to create proprietary control over it. By the early 1900s, potatoes dominated and Jerusalem artichoke was labeled old-fashioned and inferior, even though nutritionally it is superior in many ways. And fifth, there was cultural suppression tied to the erasure of indigenous knowledge systems. As Native American populations were displaced and forced onto reservations, their agricultural knowledge was deliberately destroyed. United States government policy was assimilation. Indigenous people were forced into farming European-style crops. Traditional foods like Jerusalem artichoke were stigmatized as primitive. The cultural knowledge that sustained communities for thousands of years was systematically erased within 2 to 3 generations. By the mid-1900s, even many Native Americans had lost the connection to Jerusalem artichoke as a traditional staple. Today, Jerusalem artichoke is making a quiet comeback, but only in niche markets. Some farmers markets sell it, A few specialty grocery stores carry it. Foragers and homesteaders are rediscovering it, but it remains absent from mainstream agriculture and largely unknown to the general public, and that is deliberate. Industrial food systems do not benefit from plants that make people independent. They benefit from dependence, from annual purchases, from centralized control. Jerusalem artichoke represents the opposite of that system, and that is exactly why it was buried. Now let me tell you what Jerusalem artichoke actually provides, because the nutritional profile is remarkable. The tubers are primarily composed of inulin, which as mentioned is a prebiotic fiber that feeds beneficial gut bacteria. A 100-gram serving contains approximately 73 calories, 17 grams of carbohydrates, and 2 grams of fiber. But here is what makes it unique. Those carbohydrates are mostly inulin, not starch. That means the glycemic index is low, around 50, compared to potatoes, which have a glycemic index of 70 to 85. This makes Jerusalem artichoke one of the best carbohydrate sources for blood sugar management. Jerusalem artichokes also contain significant amounts of iron, potassium, and thiamine. 100 grams provides about 3.4 milligrams of iron, which is 20% of the daily recommended intake. That is more iron than potatoes provide. They also have 429 milligrams of potassium per 100 grams, which is more than bananas. The thiamine content is particularly impressive at 0.2 milligrams per 100 grams, providing about 17% of daily needs. Thiamine is critical for energy metabolism and nerve function. The protein content is modest at 2 grams per 100 grams, but the real value is in the prebiotic inulin and the low glycemic response. For people managing diabetes, metabolic syndrome, or insulin resistance, Jerusalem artichoke is a game changer. You can eat a satisfying carbohydrate-rich meal without spiking blood sugar. Modern medicine sells expensive medications and supplements to manage blood sugar. Jerusalem artichoke does it naturally, and it grows like a weed. Let me tell you how easy it is to grow, because this is important. Jerusalem artichoke is a perennial that grows from tubers. You plant tubers in spring, and by late summer, the plants reach 6 to 10 feet tall with bright yellow flowers that look like small sunflowers. In fall, the plants die back, and the tubers are ready to harvest. You dig them up like potatoes, but here's the key difference. You do not need to harvest everything. Leave some tubers in the ground and they regrow next year. In fact, try not to leave tubers in the ground because they will regrow. This plant is incredibly vigorous. Once established, it is almost impossible to eliminate. That is perfect for food security, but problematic for farmers trying to rotate crops, which is one reason industrial agriculture does not like it. Jerusalem artichoke grows in almost any soil. It tolerates poor soil, drought, and neglect. It does not need fertilizers or pesticides. It does not require irrigation once established. You plant it once and it produces food for 20 to 30 years with minimal input. Compare this to annual crops that require tilling, planting, fertilizing, watering, weeding, and harvesting every single year. The labor and cost difference is enormous. For a homesteader or prepper, Jerusalem artichoke is one of the best food security investments possible. For industrial agriculture, it is a product that does not generate profit. Harvesting is simple. Wait until after the first frost for best flavor. Dig up tubers as needed throughout fall and winter. You can store them in the refrigerator for a few weeks, or leave them in the ground until needed. The easiest method is leaving them in the ground and digging them up fresh. Cooking Jerusalem artichoke is versatile. Eat them raw in salads, roast them like potatoes, boil and mash them. Add them to soups, or slice and fry them into chips. The flavor is mild and nutty. Some people experience digestive gas from the inulin because it feeds gut bacteria. Start with small amounts and gradually increase as your gut adjusts. For preppers and survivalists, Jerusalem artichoke is critical. In a collapse scenario where annual crop production is disrupted, perennial food sources become essential. Jerusalem artichoke continues producing even if you cannot replant other crops. It survives neglect. It tolerates poor conditions. It stores itself in the ground. You do not need functioning supply chains or access to seeds. You do not need equipment or inputs. You just need land and tubers, and once established, you have permanent food. That is the kind of resilience that industrial systems cannot offer and do not want you to have. The fact that this plant is native to North America and was a foundation of indigenous food systems makes its suppression even more significant. This is not an exotic import. This is a plant that belongs here and fed people here for thousands of years before European agricultural systems replaced it. The erasure of Jerusalem artichoke is part of the larger erasure of indigenous knowledge and food sovereignty. Reclaiming it is not just about nutrition. It is about reclaiming food independence and recognizing that the foods labeled primitive or obsolete by industrial systems are often the ones that work best for human health and ecological sustainability. Jerusalem artichoke still grows wild across much of North America. You can find it along roadsides, in abandoned fields, near waterways, and in disturbed areas. The tall stalks with yellow flowers are easy to spot in late summer. If you find wild patches, you can harvest tubers in fall and winter. Just make sure you are identifying it correctly and harvesting from clean areas not contaminated with road chemicals or pollutants. Or you can purchase tubers from specialty seed companies or farmers markets and plant your own patch. Once established, you will have food security for decades. Here's the question nobody wants you asking. Why did a plant that sustained entire civilizations for thousands of years suddenly become forgotten? Why did food that requires zero inputs and produces for decades get removed from every seed catalog? The answer is not complicated. Food independence is power. A population that can feed itself without buying seeds, without depending on supply chains, without needing corporations or governments, is a population that cannot be controlled. Jerusalem artichoke made people too independent. That is exactly why it had to disappear. If this video showed you a food source that changes everything you thought you knew about independence, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because we are exposing the plants and food systems that were deliberately buried to keep you dependent. Every single week, we bring you knowledge that threatens billion-dollar industries. Comment below and tell me if you are going to plant Jerusalem artichoke or if you have found it growing wild. Share this video with someone who needs to know the most powerful foods are the ones they tried to erase.